Okay, good morning. Versailles, the great castle. It's unbelievable how that huge castle has been copied around Europe, not completely, but was really an inspiration to so many leaders that wanted to, in fact, copy the lifestyle that Louis had set in France. So before we go into the castle, I want to talk about the the Valois branch that succeeded to Henry III when he died without any heir. It's a side branch of the Capet that came, and it's started with Henry IV, who was the Prince of Navarre, and was Protestant and was brought into on the throne under the condition, of course, that he would convert to Catholicism. As his second wife, he married Mary de' Medici. The first one was pushed away because she had been very unfaithful. And so he kind of parted with her, not officially, but I mean, the church accepted the marriage break. So he married Mary de' Medici, had a son, Louis XIII. And I'm sorry, I'm not. Yeah. There we are. Louis XIII, who married Anne of Austria, and had as the eldest son, Louis XIV. He married Mary Teresa of Spain. That was a way to pacify Europe because they were at war, and had 6 children with her. As we will see in a minute, the marriage was just a formal marriage to have children, and that was, but he had multiple mistresses. He is known for that. But after she died, he wisened up, and Madame de Maintenon, who had been in charge of some of his illegitimate children with one of his mistresses, really behaved very smartly and didn't let him come too close until he married her, which he did. He did it, but it was a morganatic marriage that was kept secret. And still some people believe that he never married her. Of course, they were both too old to have children, but she survived him. It becomes much more complicated when Louis dies, because he has the longest reign of all the French kings. He, of course, was born in 35, but his father died in 43. So by the time he was supposed to succeed his father, it's actually his mother who became the regent and took care of that. And we'll see that in a minute. Just wanted you to see that his eldest son, the Grand Dauphin, as they were called, died in 1711 of smallpox. He had 3 children with his wife, Mariana of Bavaria, and the Petit Dauphin, to differentiate his father from him, the Duke of Burgundy, had also 3 children, but he died in 1712 of measles. And actually, the 2 eldest of his children that were at his bed when he died got contaminated and died also of measles. So it's the 3rd child who became Louis XV who became king. So you see there that, in fact, Louis XV is the great-grandchild of Louis XIV. With Marie Leczinska, that was a pretty good marriage. We'll talk about it in a minute too. Had 10 children. For whatever reason, I'm on the screen too. The eldest, the Grand Dauphin, again, died 9 years before his father, had 1 child with Maria Theresa of Spain, but got 13 children with his second wife, Maria Josepha of Saxony. And so it is Louis XVI who is the grandson of Louis XV, who succeeded and who married Marie Antoinette of Austria. Try to change this. No, doesn't want. I'll be in the way. So let's look now a little bit more in detail at Louis XIV, because he's really the one that started Versailles. I mean, the transformation of Versailles. As you know, he was called the Sun King. Really did everything for his image to copy the god of Apollo and the sun, which was his symbol. Was born in 38, became king in 43, and died in 1715, as I say, the longest of the reign. He was born in the Chateau of Saint-Germain-en-Laye. His father died in 43, and so his mother, it was supposed to be a council who takes care of his place, if you want, until he was of age. But as soon as her husband died, the queen immediately ripped apart that will from the king and decided to become regent. And this is going to be a real problem, because she's going to attract a lot of hate from all the aristocrats who wanted the power to be shared with them, in a sense. And she named Cardinal Mazarin as her chief minister. And so we see two fronts. The front that had kind of internal revolt. One from 48 to 49, which is the Front Parlementaire, so from the parliament that revolts against the queen. And then from 1650 to 53, which is the Front of the Princes, where the aristocracy is going to revolt against the queen and the regent, if you want. And they literally, her and her very young son, have to flee Paris and go in hiding to avoid being killed, literally, by the nobles. And Louis is going to remember the fact that he was hungry for a while. They didn't have enough to eat. And this is the whole idea that's going to be the source, if you want, of his demeanor towards the nobles, never to trust them. And this is why he's going to make Versailles what it became. So in 51, Louis reached the age of majority, and in 54 was crowned. He married Marie Theresa of Spain in 1660, and as I said, had 6 children. Only one came to adulthood, which was pretty normal at the time. The death rate for children was enormous. In 1661, Mazarin, who was the prime minister of his mother, died, and it corresponds also at the arrest of Fouquet, and we'll talk about it in a minute too. The kind of wars he had, he was at war a lot of time. The main ones were against Spain in 1665, the Netherlands in 1670, and then the War of the League of Augsburg, between 1688 and 95. In around 1683-84, he probably, and there's more and more assurance that he married Françoise d'Aubigné after his wife died. And she remained next to him to his death, was a very wise-saying wife. She was very religious. And suddenly the king that loved frolicking here and there found himself really thinking about the afterlife, and that he better repent of all the things he did during his life. A bad date in 1685, and probably under the pressure of Madame de Maintenon, he revoked the Edict of Nantes that gave the freedom to the Protestant to worship their way. And so that was a very difficult moment for France, because it was followed by a repression on the Protestant. And in 1715, died of gangrene and other ailments. I'm not going to name them. Just for your information, these are the most known mistresses, but there were more. So you see Louise de Lavalière, who was very young. She was 17 when she met him. He was, by the way, at that time, more or less in love with his sister-in-law, the wife of his brother Philippe. And so the court, to avoid that scandal, pushed 2 or 3 very young women towards him. And Louise de Lavalière apparently was extremely nice and totally innocent, had no idea what they were doing with her. If you want to read about it, read on Louis, and they're going to tell you about Lavalière. They had 5 children. Between them, only 2 reached adulthood, and both of them were recognized and married. I mean, the young boy didn't make it to the age of marriage, but the girl did. And then the others, except for the Marquise de Montespan, were not as important. He had 7 children with the Marquise de Montespan. There was no contraception at that time, to realize. So when you were pregnant, you were pregnant. And often when they were pregnant, he would look somewhere else for compensation. So this is just to give you an idea. And it is the children of the Marquise de Montespan that the Madame de Maintenon was in charge of, and that's how he met her. By the way, just a little word, Louise de Lavalière ended up a Carmelite. Once the king pushed her away, she decided to enter the convent, and was for 30 years in the convent, and the Carmelites were very strict. So this was no fun place to be. And the interesting thing is everybody came to visit her, including the queen, who knew very well that she had been the mistress, and Madame de Montespan equally. This great-grandson of Louis XIV is Louis XV, the Beloved, was born in Versailles in 1710, so was 5 years old when his great-grandfather died. He lived for 13 years under the regency of Philippe, who was the brother of Louis XIV, and then in 25 married Leczinska and had 10 children. This, by the way, was a good marriage. They really got along extremely well. The problem, she was pregnant all the time, and had, on top of the 10 children, had many stillborn children. Finally, at the last birth or last stillborn child, the doctor told her, "You're going to die, you know, if you go on, so you should close your door to the king." And of course, this was supposed to be while you recover. And she indeed closed her door to the king, and he never came back. And so it's at that time that he started having mistresses. So anyway, the Grand Dauphin died in 65. Marie Leczinska died in 66, and he died of smallpox in 74. He had, these are the most known mistresses too, the most known being Madame de Pompadour and the Comtesse du Barry, who played quite a role next to him. The Madame de Pompadour was very much a protector of the art and played a great role during his reign to help, for example, the porcelain de Sèvres and the tapisserie de Gobelin and so on, were really privileged by her. And finally, Louis XVI didn't have a lot of time to reign. So he was born in 54, the grandson of Louis XV, became king in 74, until 92, when the monarchy was abolished and he was guillotined the year later. He was born in Versailles, married Marie Antoinette, had 4 children, only 2 survived to adulthood. No, actually, the young boy didn't even go all the way to adulthood, but the others were born, were dead almost at birth. He became king in 74. The French Revolution started in 89. The monarchy was abolished in 1792, and he was dead by guillotine in 93. So was Marie Antoinette. So before I go on with the Versailles thing, I have to talk about another figure who is not a royal, but was a really good family, from a good family. It's going to play quite a role with Louis XIV. And we are talking about Nicolas Fouquet. Nicolas Fouquet, Voltaire said that on the 17th of August at 6 in the evening, Fouquet was the king of France. At 2 in the morning, he was nobody because he'd been arrested and will have a trial that will last for 3 years before he's imprisoned until he died. He was born in Paris to an influential family of the noblesse de robe, which means noblesse de robe means lawyers. So judges and lawyers and so on. Though originally they were merchants in the cloth trade. Out of the family's 12 children who survived into adulthood, all 6 girls took vows. And among the male children, 4 took the cloth. 1 became an abbot and 2 became bishops. So that gives you also an idea. Don't forget that at that time, most of the inheritance would go to the eldest son, and the others would often be put in convents because it was an easier way, because the dowries were so huge that to marry girls was a real high cost. He received his law degree from the University of Paris. At that time, he was very much protected by Cardinal Richelieu, who was the prime minister of Louis XIV early on. In 40, he married the rich and very well-connected Louise Fourchet, who died in childbirth a year later. At that time, Fouquet purchased the manor of Vaux-le-Vicomte and its small castle that was located, and that was very convenient, 50 kilometers from Paris. After the death of the Cardinal Richelieu, Fouquet came under the protection of his successor, Cardinal Mazarin. After minor position, he was named General Intendant of Paris, which was already quite a position. In 50, he bought for 450,000 livres the important position of Procureur Général to the Parliament of Paris. So he was like the general attorney, if you want, of the Parliament of Paris. In 51, he married a 15-year-old Marie-Madeleine de Castille, with whom he had 4 children. And he received in 53 as a reward the office of Superintendent of Finance. And that was the big thing. That's being the Secretary to Treasury, the equivalent of that. So you have all the finance in your hands. He bought the Belle-Île-en-Mer, and I mentioned that. It's a little island in Brittany, and this became a place where lots of artists later on used to love to go, Monet included. So it's a very pretty island in the north of France. In 1661, and that's the big date, Louis was entertained at Vaux-le-Vicomte with a sumptuous feast. And then the same year, because Louis wasn't happy of what he saw, it was too beautiful, too perfect. While in Nantes with the king, Fouché, and sorry for the orthography, the typo, was arrested by D'Artagnan. And you know D'Artagnan, the Mousquetaire. So he arrested Fouché. And the trial lasted from 61 to 64, which was a total masquerade of a trial where he wasn't allowed to be represented, and they pulled out the archives that they wanted to pull out and so on. So most everybody agrees that he did embezzle some money, but he really was very smart in the way he held his own finances too. He inherited a lot of money from his father and did some really good things, but never talked to the king about it either. So that was the problem. He was then put in the prison fortress of Pignerol, and he died there in 1680 of apoplexy or probably poison. Now, the Fouquet, you might know a little bit of him because some people, Dumas included, romanticized his life in giving the idea that he was the one in the iron mask, but he's not. but very often people thought that it was the Iron Mask. There was no reason to hide him behind the Iron Mask. His trial was very official and everybody knew who it was. So let's talk about the Vaux-le-Vicomte that is Fouquet. It's that absolutely beautiful chateau that Fouquet built based on the small chateau that existed there, with all, of course, the dependencies, stables included. And that was done between 1658 and 61. He had a crew of wonderful architects that worked for him, and we find them there. Le Vaux was the architect, Le Nôtre was the landscapist, and Lebrun was the decorator, painter himself, but was in charge of the whole decoration of the chateau. The chateau, if you have not visited it, you should do it. It's a real beauty because it's not too large, and it's extremely refined. The gardens are absolutely beautiful. So after the disgrace of Nicolas Fouquet in 61, Louis claimed that the finest minister would not have been able to build this grand chateau without having embezzled for the crown. And so what Louis said, okay, these guys did a good job. I'm going to build my chateau now. I'm taking that whole crew. So he hired Le Vaux, Le Nôtre, and Lebrun to be in charge of the new Versailles. And it's actually the official opening ceremony of the chateau that is going to be the demise, cause the demise of Fouquet. So according to what we know, Louis arrived in company of his mother and in a large part of the court in the early afternoon and was warmly greeted by Fouquet. The guests, the royal guests and the court admired the gardens. There were lake fountains. They created a feeling of awe, which was heightened by the sight of grottos, cascades, flowerless lawns, bosquets. Bosquets are a series of bushes and small trees that typically have statues inside and allow people to get in the shade, with blooming and wonderfully scented flowers and a unique view of the chateau. The great cook, François Vatel, who was a master in courtly entertainment, supervised the meal that followed, and only the best food, the best wines, skillfully arranged and almost too delicious in taste. He knew that Louis liked eating. So everybody did their best to please Louis, from the servants to the flowers and everything. After the meal was served, the guests returned to the garden to witness the premiere of Molière, Les Fâcheux et les Impertinents. Molière was the great playwright in France, and a very wonderful critique, if you want, of society, but under very charming words. And so the king loved the play and hired Molière to repeat the play at the chateau. The whole thing was crowned, if you want, by a large firework that illuminated the chateau. And with all the things that happened, the mood of Louis went down and down and down. He couldn't believe the beauty of what he saw and became very jealous of that. He realized how Fouquet was very powerful in looking at this. So he decided, and this was already in the making for some months, his Prime Minister Colbert, who was really his advisor, was whispering in his ears about Fouquet and wanted Fouquet away. And so this was really the pinnacle of the frustration for Louis, who very quickly decided to imprison Fouquet, and you know the rest. So the thing that Louis did is looking at some of the properties he had around, and finally decided on the hunting lodge that had been built by his father in the small town that was called Versailles. He very quickly decided to enhance that little hunting lodge, which was not that little, as you can see. This is a representation of what it is, with again, you know, the other buildings that would house the servants and the smaller people of the court. So he decided on this one to be enlarged, but also he bought all the terrain, all the territory that was around Versailles to one day make it a town that would only house the officials of his court. So what he actually did is, having ground up during the disorder of the Fronde, he decided to control the government. And instead of having people living in their estates, he decided Versailles was going to become the core of the government. So he would be there, and all the aristocrats and all the people in charge of the government would live there under his control. And little by little, with the building of Versailles, people had to come there and could not leave Versailles without the special authorization of the king, could not go back to their estate, only with special permission. And Versailles was full of spies listening to every conversation, so that Louis was always very well informed. This is where we see that art is used as propaganda, and the architecture becomes the equal of royal power. Versailles was built in classical Baroque with that symmetry, clarity, and geometric regularity, which is typically French. The French are not going to go overboard, as we can see in other countries, with the Baroque style. But it also has that spatial grandeur that we see in the Baroque. It's almost 2,000 feet long, and shows really, and we'll see that, some incredible theatrical display. It was the first 20 years, let's say, were the most important in the rebuilding of Versailles, used 36,000 workers. As I say, all the people that were living there were provincial governments, they were aristocrats, they were estate general, they all lived in that surrounding. The palace housed 20,000 people that were part of the family, royal mistresses, nobility, 4,000 servants, courtiers, ministers, pets, and 9,000 soldiers outside in what you call these buildings that are tributary to Versailles. So the surface area of the roofing is 11 hectares. You multiply by 3 to have square feet. For floor space, 51,210 square meters. Number of windows, 2,153. Number of rooms, 700. Staircase, 67. Over 6,000 paintings in the collection. Lots of drawings, engravings, sculptures, pieces of furniture. So, as I mentioned, this was really the goal of Louis, is to control people around him. It was also a way of controlling people, was a very strict etiquette, and we'll see that. So as you can see, we have the architects, Louis Levaux, who will die in 70 and will be succeeded for a while by François d'Orbais, but the main successor is going to be Jules Hardouin Mansart, who is going to go on the task of Levaux. And when you hear the name Mansart, Mansart is related to the mansarde and the toit mansardé. So if you go to Paris and go to the Place des Vosges, for example, you have these big roofs that are called the toit mansard, à la mansard, because they have mansarde. Mansarde were like attics where typically the servants would live. So here is a painting giving you an idea of the construction of the Chateau of Versailles. So you can see imagine the number of people being there, and owned, of course, pulled by oxen or horses. It's quite an incredible adventure. At first, the king thought it was going to be his house, but then very quickly realized that this was the great idea. The first constructions were paid by his own revenues, but then very quickly Colbert decided that this was going to be so representative of France that France could pay for it also. So we see here the first campaign that will run more or less between 1664 to 68. And we see here the central place, which is the hunting lodge of Louis XIII. So there were 4 distinct building campaigns, just minor alteration and enlargement between 62 and 63. And then once he confiscated the estate of Fouquet, he's using Le Vau, Le Nôtre, and Le Brun, as we mentioned. And so we come with big plans, and the Chateau becomes really the equivalent of absolutism of Louis XIV. When Mazarin died, Louis decided that he would be his own chief minister. The idea of establishing, as I mentioned, the court at Versailles was conceived to ensure that all of his advisors and provincial rulers would be kept close to him. He feared so much that they would revolt against him. So that's why you had all these spies around. At first, the main works were concentrated on the parks and garden. And also he had built some detached service wings, so where most of the servants could live, because that had to be exactly at that time. To inaugurate these first gardens, the king kind of copied Fouquet and did one of the amazing reception that is going to last for 8 full days, where he invited 600 people to Versailles. And it's going to be an incredible display of power, of beauty, and really that idea that not only the king is powerful over the people just for the strength, if you want, but also by the nobility of his character, by the fact that he's very knowledgeable and that he wants to concentrate around him a whole series of scientists and musicians and painters and so on. So this was part of an overall image of the king. We have at this time to talk about the opera. The opera had become quite important, and it particularly started early on with the Italians that came, and you had the Commedia dell'arte and so on. And so the theater, the opera and theater had become an important part of the French society, already starting with his father, Louis XIII, where you had regular theatrical performances. And again, this was part of the idea that you wanted a display well-rounded, if you want, of power, but also of the arts that were becoming part of the image. And literally attending a theatrical performance was quickly becoming a sign of stature of the king. And that the court, the marble court that you have, which is the core of Versailles, was a perfect place. So very often when it was a large representation, this would be the backdrop, if you want, of the stage. And they would use that before the opera was built, which is going to happen later on. Let me see if I can show this one. Yep. So Okay, this was just to give you an idea of the kind of music that they were listening to. This was the music of Lully. And Lully was working often with Molière in setting the stage for all his beautiful comedies. So that day, the first day, the king was in that incredible carriage where he represented the sun, was preceded by a whole series of nobles who were carrying palms and other things to just announce, if you want, the arrival of the king. And he went around the garden that had been built at that time and came back to the chateau. By that time, the stage had been set. And so every day they saw a different play. And this was accompanied by banquets, by music, and all kinds of entertainments. This was called the plaisir, the l'île enchantée, the pleasures of the enchanted island. And you can see very well the chateau there, the core of the marble court here. So this is only at the very beginning of Versailles. There were horse races. They were literally, I think, it was in the previous one. You could see an elephant. They had elephants and dromedaries, all kind of animals that would come and be part of the entertainment. The second campaign, all these campaigns, by the way, correspond to the end of a war. So the war ends, so they can go on building. So in 1774, we see that this has changed. So we had only this to start with. So this has been covered, what we call the envelope around the hunting lodge. And we now have not only the marble court, but the royal court. So this corresponds to the end of the War of Devolution, where it's when they are fighting on the succession of the King of Spain. As the last Habsburg has died without heir, the whole of Europe is fighting to put one of theirs as a King of Spain, because that would be a big power gain. So Levaux is going to give the facade, but the exterior facade. So what you have here, a very Italian looking facade, very classical Italian style. But don't forget that the marble court is still very much the end of the Renaissance with brick and stone. So we have two styles that almost clashing, if you want, and the king is not very happy. But what happens is that Levaux is going to die, and then the king is going to go into a war again. And so here's more or less the way the Chateau looks towards the end. This is with the third campaign, 1678 to 82, when they put these large wings there that are mostly for the aristocrats that live in Versailles. And then all the dependencies are the stables and lodging for the servants. By that time, the king had bought all the territory around the chateau and had the old village raised down, and they built townhouses that were similar to Versailles, where the nobility could live in rather small quarters. So he was completely surrounded. And here's a view of Versailles at that time. This is at the end of the 17th century and the way they lived. So you had the big entrance, the big gate, but all around here was the town of Versailles with the amenities for the other people that couldn't live in the chateau. And then you can see huge gardens that we'll see in a minute. And a view from the Cour d'Honneur. So the honor court finishing all the way there to what used to be the small hunting lodge. And here's the plan. So this is then by by the end of the 17th century, finally, Ardouin Mansart comes and then he builds the Galerie des Glaces, the Hall of Mirrors that finishes. This was open before. And so he's going to put the Hall of Mirrors. This is where we'll see at the end, but that was built by Louis Philippe in the 19th century. That's the gallery of the war paintings. And then the chapel and the opera that were built later on in the 18th century. Again, we come back here because we'll see on the plan that these are all the small apartments of the king and the queen. Always at a piano nobile is done in Italy. You're never on the ground floor, but that's what we call the second floor in America, and we call in France the first floor. Are here, these are the apartments of the queen, and these are the petits appartements, the small apartments of the king. The state apartments are on the outside of the building, as you can see here. So in navy blue, in dark blue, you have the state apartments of the king. In medium blue, you have the apartment of the kings, and then in light blue, the little apartments of the king. So you have three different levels. And then here, the grand appartement of the queen, the state apartments of the queen, and her little apartment. She only has two kinds. At first, the way to enter the palace was that beautiful escalier des ambassadeurs, the staircase of the ambassador, that was built from 74 to 80, but was demolished in 1762 by Louis XV, who wanted a small courtyard for his private apartments. And so it was taken down. So this is just a reconstruction of the way it looked. And you can see it in the painting by Jean-Léon Gérôme of the reception of the Grand Condé à Versailles by Louis XIV. So you can imagine how spectacular as an entrance this was. Let's look a little bit at the apartments of the king, and they're based, actually, we just saw it in the previous classes, on the Pietro da Cortona's decoration of the Palazzo Pitti in Florence, and based on the same succession of rooms, all dedicated to different constellations and dedicated to the main king, the main gods of Greece. So we have the progression from the bottom there, Salon of Hercules, Abundance, Venus, Diana, Mars, Mercury, Apollo. And then the last one would have been Jupiter, but it ends up being transformed in the Salon of the War, as we'll see. And all this was in the hand of Charles Lebrun. So this is the Hercules drawing room. That was the room at the bottom through which you would go to reach the chapel. Before the big chapel was built, there was a small chapel there. Large room that became a ballroom depending on the king. You know, these were repurposed depending on the king who was alive at that time. But at that time was just a drawing room, and one of the first entrances, you know, this is where the king would have all his reception of ambassadors and so on. So they had to go through all these rooms and admire all the art. So of course, you have a painting by François Lemoine with the apotheosis of Hercules in the ceiling. And then two interesting paintings, both by Veronese, that were offered to the king by the city of Venice. This is the very large one that is facing the chimney, showing the feast in the house of Simon that was offered as a diplomatic gift by the city of Venice to Louis XIV. It was too large when it was given at first, and so it was put in the Louvre, and then finally was returned to Versailles not too long ago in the 1960s. A slightly smaller is the Salon of the Abundance, which was the antechamber to the cabinets of curiosity, which is now the game room. So again, you have a repurposing of many of these rooms. The game room was displaying Louis XIV's collection of precious jewels and rare objects. The Salon of Venus, this was used for serving light meals during the evening receptions. And you have a painting by Ouas showing Venus subjugating the gods and powers, and trompe-l'oeil paintings all around the lunettes. The Salon of Diana was used by Louis XIV as a billiard room and had galleries from which courtiers could watch him play. Now you can see there something you might be familiar with. We talked about it. And this is the famous bust by Bernini of Louis XIV. This is the ceiling of that same salon. Absolutely gorgeous. And you can see, for those of you that saw the class on the Cortona, how Cortona has really influenced Lebrun there. A very large room, the Salon de Mars, was used by the Royal Guards until 1782 and was ornated with military themes and helmets and trophies of all kinds. Then it was turned into a concert room between 1684 and 1750 with galleries for musicians on either side. And you have there portraits of Louis XV and Mary Leczinska by Carl van Loo. The Salon of Mercury was the original state chamber, bedchamber, when Louis XIV officially moved the court and the government in 1682, but then was changed. And when they renovated, because remember, the French Revolution happened between the time they decorated and now. So all these rooms were redecorated, and the furniture was brought in with the decision to show it at a certain period in time. But these rooms have changed a lot along the decades and the centuries. What is interesting, the automaton clock that you see there was showing, when it was chiming the hour, the figure of Louis XIV and fame descending from a cloud. And finally, the Salon of Apollo was where the royal throne was, and you can see the stage. But the throne was made of silver and was melted to be able to pay for some of the wars that Louis was going. Most of the furniture in Versailles, in the state apartments and in the Hall of Mirrors, were made of solid silver, and but were all melted down to pay in the 1680s for some of the wars, and replaced by gilded wood. And here is the ceiling by Charles de la Fosse. Now, the Hall of Mirrors is very much the central point for everybody. When you visit Versailles, all you want to see is the Hall of Mirrors. It's actually, as I said, it was part of the third campaign. And it's ended on each side. One on the queen side of the apartments, it's the Salon of Peace. And on the king side, it's the Salon of War. The architecture was by Ardouin Mansart, and the decorations were still by Lebrun and his crews. Not him alone, of course. He had a whole crew. And so just wanted to show you that here. So this gives access to the Queen's state apartment, and this is access to the King's state apartment. And this was supposed to be the Salon of Jupiter and has been transformed in the Salon of War. And this is the famous room, the Salon of War, where Clio is writing the history of the king's deeds. The work started in 1678 and was finished off with Lebrun decoration in 1686. Of course, you have to finish all the architecture before you can start painting. And the overall decor depicts the victories of France and then leads up to the launching for peace at Nijmegen. You have that low relief showing the king on his horse. And then you have all around, you have trophies that are celebrating all the victories of the king. And then you, of course, get into the Hall of Mirrors, which is that extraordinary room, mostly represented in other copies of Versailles. Because of its incredible beauty, the idea of having the light, each mirror faced by a large door with large windows, where allowing the light to come in and reverberate. Now, what you see here, all these candle holders used to be solid silver and have been replaced by gilded wood. There are 17 large mirrors with the windows opposite. Of course, sunlight is equivalent to the king. The problem what they had recently, because they were restoring all the mirrors, as you can see, they're made of small mirrors. There was no way at that time to build a large mirror. The technology did not exist. And all these mirrors are still made the old-fashioned way with Mercury behind. And there's only one craftsman in France who can still do that. And so they went all around France to try to find still some remnants of other mirrors made the way to be able to restore it the absolute traditional way. And then with the help of that craftsman, we're able to, yes, John?
You see these amazing statues, these chandeliers are just gorgeous. Are these artists recognized? I mean, the ones behind stuff we don't.
Most of the chandeliers would come from Venice, but at that time the problem was that Venice had a monopoly to make mirrors, and the king broke the monopoly of making the mirrors in Versailles and literally bought up some workers in Versailles to come to France to start that technology in France. What is interesting that the first series that did it were assassinated by the Venetians, who didn't want the technology to be known by other countries. And then finally he was able to bribe them to come over. And here are the ceilings, all celebrating the deeds of Louis XIV. And I brought in a few images, historical images, to give you an idea how it was used. So here you have, for example, the reparation made to Louis XIV by the Doge of Genoa. And so you can see that the throne behind Louis is at that time a solid silver throne.
What happens to the throne?
They were melted to pay for the wars that Louis was doing during his reign. All the furniture, lots of furniture was made of solid silver. Here is a later view. This is in the 18th century. So this is under Louis XV, a mask ball in the Hall of Mirrors. And then some more down-to-earth images when the hall is transformed into a military hospital during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. So this is under Napoleon III. This is the proclamation of Prussian King William I as German emperor, and that took place in Versailles. And you can recognize Bismarck and the emperor and all the Ernest II, Duke of Saxe-Coburg, and Frederick I, Grand Duke of Baden, all there. Then the German peace treaty in 1918, that's of course the famous Treaty of Versailles, which is unfortunately in great part the cause of the World War II. And then a painting by William Oppen of the signing of the peace in the Hall of Mirrors in 19, and you can recognize Clemenceau and all the big figures. There are some Maharajas and all known people around Europe and the known world. Now, on the other side of the Hall of Mirrors, and on the way to the apartments of the Queen, is the Salon of Peace, showing Louis XV. So this is a later room, showing Louis XV bestowing peace on Europe by François Lemoine also. And François Lemoine was so exhausted when he finished that he committed suicide. He had painted a whole series of ceiling and he just couldn't follow the pressure that was put on him. Now, the grands appartements of the king and the queen, it's this for the king, and we'll just show very few rooms because not all of them have been restored, and they're not, frankly, very interesting except for the bedrooms and the Grand Couvert. The Grand Couvert is quite interesting because this was a way for Louis to keep the power on people. So typically, the king and the queen would sit at the table. The very high level of aristocracy could sit on these ottoman-like features, and everybody else had to stand for hours watching the king eating and the queen. The exception to that was Marie Antoinette, who hated the etiquette and who never removed her gloves when she was behind the table. Therefore, she wasn't eating. And she didn't like that kind of food. So she made an exception. She didn't do it. But people would literally spend hours standing or a few sitting down to watch the king eating.
And I read that the king had in the morning a sort of kind of a first awakening.
Yeah, I'm coming to that. No, this is the couvert. That's the eating. So now we're coming to the etiquette for the lever. So you had different lever. The lever means rise, and it's the lever du soleil, the rise of the sun, which was in fact the way the king would get up in the morning. So you had the petit lever, that was the valet coming, waking him up, and then you had the very, very privileged could be there, but just 2 or 3 people, not more. And then he would move, they had special hallways and so on behind the walls. And he would go to this one, which was the grand lever, so the big rise, if you want. And there, all the courtiers could be behind that fence, if you can call galleries here. And they could see the king then getting up from the bed and they would put a jacket on him, and there they could come and ask him for favors. So this was the whole idea. The Queen had a similar thing, but for other purposes. Now, also, when you look at the extraordinary wall covers and so on, these are all fabrics made in, woven in Lyon with gold and silk and so on. They would change all the tapestry, the wall tapestry, as well as all the upholstery of the seats every 6 months, so that they could have the summer motifs and they would have the winter motif. The summer motifs would be a light background with some gold and red or pink, and the winter was more this type with the rich reds and the golds. Same thing for the Queen. This is the Queen bedchamber, but this one dates back to Marie Antoinette. And she would also have the petit levé and the grand levé, but she would also take care of young children, orphans. And so they could come to her bed and she would bless them. And from that time on, they would be taken care of by the court. Extraordinary bed, if you look at the way, what you call the impérial. And then on the right, really interesting, that's the serre bijou, that was the jewelry box. Look at the detail with the shell and all the embroidery and the ostrich feathers. And then finally, as I mentioned, you have the later construction of the chapel and the opera that were built. The Royal Chapel is going to be built between 1689 and 1710. Sorry, I'm one early here. You can see, again, a gallery, because on the ground floor was only the king and his family were the only one allowed. So people that were authorized to come to the chapel would be in the galleries. And then finally, in the in the late 18th century, then they decide to build an opera. And the architect was Ange-Jacques Gabriel, who built that royal opera. That was one of the biggest additions of Louis XV to Versailles. It was constructed entirely of wood and painted to resemble marble, using the technique of faux marble. So it was complete in 1770 and was inaugurated at the time of the wedding festivities of Louis XV's grandson, the Dauphin, who was future Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. It's beautiful.
And it could seat 1,000.
Excellent acoustic.
1,000 people. It's bigger
Yes.
than any opera house today.
Yeah, so it could actually accommodate sitting down 712 people, but then they had a special mechanism where they could elevate the floor to the same level as the stage and make it a ballroom, and then they could accommodate 1,200 people.
And think of how they changed all those candles.
I know.
Fire hazard.
But everywhere, yes, absolutely. So here is just a representation of a banquet for the Queen Victoria that was hosted in the opera. And then finally, the Museum of History of France that was organized by Louis Philippe, so much later in the 19th century, where you have all the large battle paintings for that were commissioned by Napoleon, and then earlier one by the Louis. So I'm giving you 5 minutes if you need, because we need to wrap up, but I still have to show you the gardens and the Trianons. So just take 5 minutes. People, if you have questions, just ask. I'm sorry, I can't get rid of me down there. That's whatever.
I have a question.
Yes.
This is the Louis XIV was the Sun King from Apollo, the Greek god of war.
Yeah.
What was Louis
Not the war. He was the arts.
The
He was
arts?
the sun. Yes, Mars was the gun.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
What was Louis XIV's relationship with God? Because I'm not seeing anything referring to God in all of Versailles. No, the art is not referring to God.
No, this is a purely. I mean, he was going to mass regularly because.
Who in the hierarchy did, like Henry VIII, when Henry spoke, he spoke for God because
he became the head of the Church of England. Whereas Louis is not. Louis is a Catholic, and so he responds to the Pope.
Right. Yeah. So Louis' relationship with God is more like anybody.
But there is a statement by him that says, "I am the lieutenant of God."
Mm-hmm.
The lieutenant.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because he had bishops and cardinals that were between him and the Pope that were in charge of the church.
So he didn't put himself.
No. No, but he had a lot of authority on France since the schism of Avignon. Was authorized to, it's the king with the help of the other bishops and cardinals who would nominate, if you want, the hierarchy in France. So they were in charge of who was going to become cardinal and bishop and so on. It was not the Pope.
Okay. There's a sense of separation that his relationship.
And that dates back to Avignon. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Any question online there? No? Okay. We just going to ask people. There's one more person. No, she's there. No, you just have a large cup. You push. Do you have to put the coffee in? Did you put the capsule in?
Yes.
Okay. And then you push on the large cup.
I've been to Versailles, and the sense of the bedchambers is that there's absolutely no privacy.
No, they didn't want privacy.
The king and the queen, when they did sleep together, they slept together in this very public.
No. They had their own, I told you, they have that room was a room of what you call apparat. So they had their bedroom.
There was a private.
Yeah, that was part of in the appartement of the king. And the petit appartement of the queen, they had their bedroom. That's where they were sleeping. That one was purely to show.
Okay.
I think so. I think they do some performances there. And the mechanism still works to bring up the floors. They don't use it though.
But most of it was Versailles museum.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, we're gonna go on, people. If you could turn off the light. Is it working?
Missed a big opportunity inventing roller skates. What do you think?
Is it working?
Yeah, he is just warming up.
Oh, okay. So moving to the gardens, which of course are spectacular over there. 7 square miles of park, lakes, forest, bosquet, which are kind of formal gardens. And went through the two building campaigns, the first one where they developed the gardens, and then between 64 and 68, they started working on fountains, the Grand Canal and so on, that you can see that really faces the gallery, the Hall of Mirrors. You have the Grand Canal, and where literally they would have miniatures, ships and gondolas and so on, and that would go on these water basins and so on. And then a whole series of bosquets that are more here, these formal garden. And then here you can see on that large map, you can see the Grand Trianon and the Petit Trianon that we'll talk about in a minute. The Grand Canal is 1,500 meters long and a width of 62 meters. They receive gondolas from the Doge of Venice. Now, the role of the canal is important because it drains the water from the fountains and then is recycled to the reservoir and can come back for the fountain. And we'll talk about it because this is quite an adventure. Here you have another view of the gardens. On the side, to the right side of the Versailles is also the orangerie. And what used to be the Grot of Titus that has been destroyed since. The orangerie was built between 1684 and 86. And was housing, literally, you had a special building in which you would roll all these orange trees, more than 2,000 of them. Every winter, these orange trees would be housed to protect them in the buildings. But then they would be taken out during the summer. And then you had all the hedge that you can see there, clipped in geometric design. And right now they plant about 4 million tulip bulbs every year. As we mentioned, the son, the king was taking the name of the god of sun, Apollo. And so that was that kind of Hellenistic model to compare yourself with gods. And so you see all kind of different motifs that are going to show Apollo, which of course, and as we know, is a representation of Louis XIV. So early on, they had made that the Grot of Thetis, which had some interesting purpose. It also was part of the reservoir for the fountains, but then it was destroyed to make an additional building once they built the wings. And within these grot were groups of statues, one by Girardon with Apollo attended by the nymphs. And of course, we know who Apollo was. Now, these statues had been relocated. But the basins and fountains, really what makes the gardens of Versailles, these incredible fountains. This is the large basin facing the gallery, the Hall of Mirrors that you see here. So in 1664, Louis XIV commissioned, sorry, I'm always ahead of one for the other people, so sorry for that. Louis XIV commissioned a series of statues intended to decorate the water feature of the Parterre d'Eau. So it comprised 24 statues of classic deities and showing all the gods and the symbolism all around it. And so here is one of the largest ones, the Fountain of Latona. Latona and her children, Apollo and Diana. So Latona was the mother of Apollo and Diana. And here you see her tormented by mud-slung Lycian peasants who refused to let her and her children drink from their pond. And so she appealed to Jupiter, who responded by turning the Lycians into frogs. And that's what you see in front of you there. Here is the fountain in play. And the fountain is always, we have to realize, it's adding another dimension to the sculptures that you see in front of you, because it becomes alive. You now have the play with the light and so on. Here is an aerial view of the same fountain. And I'm not showing you all of them. I'm showing the two most important. This is the fountain of Apollo, where you see Apollo pulled by the horses. And once it is in work. No, now we come to the big point. They didn't have electricity at that time, no pumps to bring the water that way. So this was the big problem. How to bring enough water, because there are many fountains, more than this. How can you bring the water there? So they tried different things, and it was never sufficient. So they didn't have enough pressure. Did you see the number of jets that are there? So the biggest trial that they did is called the Machine de Marly. That was built as a second solution to this, and literally detouring some water from the Seine River all the way to Versailles through an aqueduct on the top. So actually what they say is, before that Marly machine was created, the amount of water delivered to Versailles already exceeded that used by the city of Paris as a whole. But the Machine of Marly was decision when the king put somebody in charge. He wasn't an engineer, and he found in Belgium some people that had invented a process to remove the water, stagnant water, from the mines. And so inventing a system of pistons and so on to bring out the water that were in mines in the south of Belgium at that time. He hired the people. They had also done, by the way, a smaller scale series of fountain for a chateau along the Meuse River, the Chateau of Modave. And so he decided to hire them together with a whole series of Walloons that were living in south of Belgium, and they came and put together that idea. So here you can see the Seine River, and where they built all kinds of dams to let the water being derived with the machine this way. So you still had water going the other side and a little bit down here, enough to feed the tree. And this is the machine that they came up with. So there is, you have to realize, 490 feet difference in relief between the Seine and the top of the hill. And then they had, and plus another 325 feet altogether. So a lot of differences in relief. The reservoir, where they were reservoir at different level to collect the water and then send it back up. Now the main machine is absolutely incredible. And that was the one that was created by the Sualem brothers. And here is a detail of that system of pump. So you see these large wheels, and then you had pistons all around, and this with another system was launching the water to the height that you could see on the side. Just an incredible machine. And I will give you access to this. I don't know if it's gonna work on the, but here you have an idea on how this was working, and I will send it to people online. 14 36 feet wheels. That we're just filling up. I'm not going to say because I'm running late, and I'm going to give you access to these YouTubes. Sorry, and finally, let me see, because this was not even enough for the fountains to work by themselves. So what happened is that you had servants that would precede the king when he was walking through the gardens, would open the valves to start the fountain so that the king could enjoy it. But behind him, there were other servants that would shut off the ones he had already seen. So he could, there was not necessary, and that was giving enough pressure for the time. They tried to resolve that problem by detouring a whole river to add water pressure to the system. And they were in the process of building an aqueduct that was larger than the Pont du Gard in the south of France. But then another war came in, and they had to stop in the middle of their process. So this is as advanced as what we could see, but it's quite extraordinary for the time. And really, that whole building of Versailles gave birth to all kind of inventions to try to perfect the chateau. And so you have the creation of the Academy of Science that's going to help in these technological aspects. For example, the Academy of Art, to make enough artists to help Lebrun paint, decorate the chateau. So they also built two main houses that were dedicated to the king to have some privacy, as we were talking about not having privacy. Before the Trianon, they had a little menagerie, a little zoo that was built in 1664, but then was destroyed in 1801, where they had all kind of very exotic animals, and they were offered typically by ambassadors when they would come to see the king. But the most important were the Trianon. And at first, they built what is called the porcelain, the Trianon de porcelain, made of porcelain, that were not made, it was all covered with blue tiles, not made in Delft, but made in France, copying the Delft tiles. But that was made, the Petit Trianon was made just of wood and very fragile. So it kind of fell apart pretty quickly. Here is an artistic representation of that, one of the buildings of the Petit Trianon, the Trianon de porcelain. And apparently this is where Louis would entertain his mistresses quietly. And here I have a very bad reproduction of a way. This is one of the scenes that would be performed for Louis inside the Trianon with Madame de Montespan. And so very quickly, the Petit Trianon de porcelain started falling apart. And so they decided to take it down and build instead the Grand Trianon made of marble. And that's that beautiful Trianon that you see there in the center, far away enough from the main building that they could have some privacy. And this was occupied by different members of the family, depending on the generation. Here is the colonnade. So it's made of two main bodies, if you want, and then you have that colonnade in between for them to go from one to the other. Typically, the one on the left was the king with the servant quarters, and on the right were the reception rooms. And all made of red marble from Languedoc. And then later on was built, this is in the 18th century, the Petit Trianon was built between 62 and 68. Again, this was more used by Marie Antoinette, by the way, where she, as I mentioned, hated the etiquette. She didn't like to be around people that she knew didn't like her because the sisters of Louis XV had fomented the whole war against Marie Antoinette and really demeaning her. And so she really felt much more comfortable by herself, which became a problem. Became a problem with the crowd because she was qualified. You know, she was qualified of being off standing, not wanting to socialize. And there, Marie Antoinette loved opera and theater, and then she decided to build her own little theater, and it's just that the much smaller one where she would perform together with her ladies in waiting. She also had the fameux hameau, which is that little village where they had functioning buildings. So they had farms, they had places where they would do some husbandry and so on. And apparently with the new techniques, the newest techniques existing at that time. And it was mentioned the fact that they would just go around in shepherdess costume and so on. This is not true. This was invented by her enemies. She liked to be dressed very simply, as Vigée Lebrun has represented her. So just dresses made of muslin that was very light, that was not with all the embroidery and so on. And but as I said, she had lots of enemies, and so they twisted very much what she was doing. Now, Louis, as I mentioned, and with Versailles, started a whole series of academies that were privileging the formation of artists and of scientists that in many ways helped Versailles too. So he founded the Academy of Painting and Sculpture in 48, Academy of Science in 66, Academy of Music in 69, and Academy of Architecture in 71. And of course, we know that all these excesses are going to little by little lead to the French Revolution. And so this is on that image of the sun setting that we're going to finish our walk through Versailles. I hope that you have enjoyed. And next time we'll finish the Baroque area with the late Baroque in paintings and architecture. Thank you so much.
And so those YouTubes you're going about the
Let me
water
just,
machine, you're gonna.
yes, I'm going to send you, let me just stop the recording.